Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you to the Diverse Jewish Books podcast, where today I have the pleasure of talking with Aimee Lucido, author of novels and picture books for kids, puzzle maker, and former software engineer. Hi, Aimee.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here.
Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and what being Jewish looks like to you?
Yeah, so I am an author, I am a puzzle maker, and I am a Jewish one of all of those things. I was raised in a very secular household. It's actually taken me a very long time to be able to comfortably say that I'm Jewish in a way that feels honest. For a long time, I would say I'm Jewish because I did not grow up going to temple. I cannot speak Hebrew outside of the four prayers that I picked up at like Hanukkah parties over the years. I did not have a bat mitzvah, but later in life, in college and beyond, I started to get interested in exploring my Jewish heritage or just what it means to be Jewish. And so I started going to some services and I started celebrating holidays that I'd never celebrated before. And it led to me writing my book, Recipe for Disaster, which is about a girl with a very similar background to me who decides to go behind her parents' back and give herself a bat mitzvah. It's about taking control of your Jewish identity, which is something that I needed growing up. It's a book that I needed as a kid, and so I hope other kids find it. And I hope that it gives them the permission to be the type of Jew that they want to be.
In your personal life, as you were approaching Judaism in college and beyond, was there a particular moment for you where you felt that spark of connection or interest or curiosity in connecting with that identity?
So for me, it came about in two ways. One was through music, and one was through food. Growing up, the food was probably the primary one, which is why Recipe for Disaster is so much about food. But I would say the moment that actually probably sparked it a little bit more in college for me was the music. I grew up in choirs, I grew up singing, and I've always been very affected by music. And there was I think it was a Friday night service called Havurah, and I would go just with friends for fun, and we would just sing these really cool songs, and I would get so into it, and it was just really fun to be connecting with Jews in this way in this language that I spoke, because even though I had never had much background in my own Jewish identity growing up, suddenly there was this language that I did speak, which was music, and that made me feel really included in a way that I really loved, and that sparked going to more services and exploring more of what Judaism meant to me.
So you have Recipe for Disaster, talks about Jewish identity. You also recently wrote a chapter book called Lucky Penny. Can you tell
Lucky
us a little
Penny.
bit about that too?
Yeah, so Lucky Penny is a chapter book. It's in some ways extremely different from Recipe for Disaster. It's about a girl who's obsessed with luck. She likes lucky charms and lucky bracelets and lucky pieces of lint and lucky socks. And she one day finds a penny on the ground and picks it up thinking it's lucky before her best friend, who is obsessed with bad luck, tells her it's actually unlucky because it's head down. And so she starts to believe that she's cursed and that she needs to reverse her bad luck. And the whole thing takes place right around Rosh Hashanah. And so the big thing that's coming up is the Rosh Hashanah picnic, and she wants to blow the shofar at the picnic. And so it's about friendship and atonement and choosing your own fate going into the new year. And there's food in that one too, because I like food.
There's this very Jewish soul about Lucky Penny. And one of the things that I really appreciate about it in particular is it's about luck and it's about friendship. And it's not about being Jewish, but the setting just happens to be a very Jewish one. Can you tell us a little bit about the inspiration for Lucky Penny?
Yeah. So when I wrote the book, actually the first iteration was only very incidentally Jewish. I was writing it around the same time that I was writing Recipe for Disaster. And so I was coming into my own with my own Jewish identity. And so I wanted Penny to be Jewish and I wanted her to go to a Jewish day school. But the book in its original iteration really didn't have much to do with Judaism. It was really just these are Jewish kids at a Jewish school talking about luck. And it was only after I kept revising Lucky or Recipe for Disaster that I was like, I think I want this book to be more Jewish. And so I decided to set it on the it's not the eve of Rosh Hashanah, but in the lead up to Rosh Hashanah. And as I did that, more and more of the story started to unfold. And as a writer, I love those moments where a choice is the right choice when it like makes it easier to write the book instead of harder. And so as soon as I was like, no, this is a Jewish book. We're gonna make this about Rosh Hashanah. We're gonna make this about the shofar. It just every step of it became more interesting. And I think actually the shofar ended up being a really late addition, like after I'd originally sold the book, because I knew I wanted Penny to want something. In the earlier iterations, I think she wanted to sing the school song or like she wanted the lead in a play. And it's interesting in hindsight to realize that came so late because that is the heart of the book. And the fact that she wants to blow the shofar, that would only work in a Rosh Hashanah book. The heart of it is very Jewish, which is interesting because it wasn't always that way. But I think it's become so much better since.
It is such a good book that really does have this heart about it. And I really like that you bring up atonement too, because obviously that's so thematically relevant in that time of year. And it's not so outward. And it's something that we talk about at the end of the book, but really you don't necessarily see it throughout. So I love that you bring that up here in this conversation.
Yeah, atonement's a big theme in a lot of my work, honestly, Jewish or otherwise.
That sounds like a very Jewish theme, though. I just want to spend some time talking about Recipe for Disaster. You said you were coming into your own Jewish identity at a time when you were writing this. Talk to me about what that discovery was like for you and how it mirrored that of the discovery of the main character, Hannah, in the book.
So I had gone on a birthright trip when I was 27, like the very end of the time where I was eligible. And I felt out of place the whole time because I had also just gotten engaged. And it was just like a really weird thing to have been, to get engaged to a Greek Orthodox man, by the way, to be on this trip where everyone's hooking up with each other. Like they're trying to like talk about like Jewish babies. I'm like the oldest person on the trip. There was maybe one other person older than me who like was technically ineligible, but lied about her age or something. It was a very surreal experience. But part of it was like I felt a little bit like a fraud because I was like, I snuck in here, like I wasn't bar mitzvah, like my bad, I like shouldn't be allowed here. The funny thing is, a lot of the other people there had the same background that I did. Where one person, she was adopted into a Jewish family, and another one, like her birth mother wasn't Jewish. And so from talking to all these people who all felt like, and some people had extremely Jewish backgrounds, where like they were bat mitzvah and they grew up going to temple every weekend, but they've since left that behind and they felt like frauds. And I'm like, maybe feeling like a fraud is a Jewish experience. And so I wanted to write about that and how every single person on this trip had some insecurity about whether they were Jewish enough. And one of the interesting things that happened is we were so they put you with Israeli soldiers, and so we were with these people for a while. And I think there was a period of time where they were like annoyed at us that we were so secular, and they're like, these people aren't real Jews. And then we had a Shabbat dinner one night, and every single person, myself included, knew all the prayers. And suddenly it was this moment of, oh wait, we actually are connecting. We are all connected through this religion, no matter how we practice it. We know the words to these songs. We know the foods that we're eating. Like I've had a lot of challah in my life, even though I never really went to temple. And it just sparked this conversation of like inside of me of what does it mean to be Jewish? Who is allowed to permit someone to be Jewish? Because it is this like religion and also an ethnicity, and it's also a culture, and it's so many things, and it can mean so many different things to so many people. And anytime there is a big question that I feel like I understand the answer to, but I can't explain it in words, that's a book. Like I need a whole novel in order to explain how I feel about this thing. And so that's how that book came to be.
There is so much complexity that you distill down beautifully for a middle grade. If people haven't read A Recipe for Disaster yet, they should. It's even appropriate for adults. I loved it. Can you talk about how you approached writing about identity for that audience and the complexities of self discovery?
Tried to approach the book was I was not going to be able to write this book in like a general sense. This was going to have to be a very specific person's very specific journey to her own Judaism. And the way that I wanted to handle that while not making it so niche that only one type of person could relate to it is I wanted every character in the book to represent a different voice in Judaism and a different presentation of Judaism. And obviously, there's so many more presentations that I couldn't include in the book because every Jewish person has their own Jewish identity. I can't write everyone's story, but I wanted to write a enough different kinds that it felt there was conflict, there was balance, and there was some sort of resolution in the end.
Can you talk to us about some of the different backgrounds that you did represent in the book?
Yeah. So the main character, Hannah, her story is very similar to mine. She is growing up in a very secular household where her mother was raised Jewish but doesn't practice. Her father was raised Catholic but doesn't practice. So that's three different identities right there. Um, Her grandmother represents a very like old school traditional form of Judaism. And then there's Aunt Yael, who is a complicated character in her own right, where she's represented different types of Judaism over the course of her life. I won't go into too much detail there, but the Yael that you spend the most time with, I based her a little bit off of a friend of mine from college, actually, who was a rabbi. He is basically my rabbi in effect, and he has a welcoming form of Judaism, and he really just wants people to feel as Jewish as they want to feel. And that's what I aspire to and what I wish everybody felt. He's the person I based Yael on. There's also Shira, who represents the Jewish kids that I grew up with, where I was jealous of them. They had a more traditional relationship with Judaism, but she's also a kid. She hasn't necessarily thought as much about Judaism as an adult might, but she also has probably thought more about it than Hannah has because she grew up in a much more religious household. And then there's V, who is also has a strong relationship with her Judaism, but doesn't have the same parentage that a lot of Jews would consider valid. And that is also another source of conflict in the story.
Were there any challenges that you had or specific considerations when you were writing these characters?
Most of these characters are not my lived experience. Something that we talk about so much in the world of publishing and children's publishing in particular is you really want to write a story that you can tell extremely authentically. It's such an important thing, and it's also such a difficult thing because in any story, you're going to populate your story with people that are both like you and not like you. In order to create good art, you have to be able to both of those equally well. And so I wanted to just make sure that every character I put in the story was believable and honest. I wasn't like trying to tell anyone else's story and that I wasn't getting things wrong. That was really important to me too. It's very possible that there are mistakes in there, but I tried my darndest to keep everything as accurate and as honest as possible. I also wanted to not draw neat conclusions for the reader. Like I think sometimes, well, books like that can feel didactic, and um, I think also that can also feel dishonest to some readers too, because if you don't agree with the conclusion in the book, then it can feel like that didn't resonate with me. So I wanted ultimately for these characters to be left to breathe on the page. They're not necessarily, we're not solving everything in the 300 pages of the story. And ultimately, it's up to the reader to reach their own conclusions about who all these characters are and what their Judaism means.
Who was the most difficult character for you to write about and get into the perspective of?
Probably the mother. So the mother character is she's had a rough go of it with Judaism, and so her relationship with it isn't the best. And it's difficult as a Jewish author to write a character like that because you don't want to turn people off to Jude. We talk about the danger of a single story. And if this is the only Jewish person in your whole life, then you're going to leave having a negative impression of it. And so it's hard to write. You don't have that much space in a middle grade novel. You can't get it super, super deep with every single character. And so trying to balance her earned hostility towards it while still making her feel like a sympathetic character and understanding her motivations for trying to keep her daughter away from it while still not hating her because like modern readers were it's easier for a modern reader to read that and be like, oh, like I can't believe she's doing this. Or so I found writing her to be difficult.
I love that because you're right. That is such a tough perspective to take to make her be someone you can also empathize with.
Yeah,
I'm going to raise a controversial topic now.
please.
So, there's an organization called the Jews of Color Initiative, which I love and am so grateful for the research they're doing. One of the things that they've published research on in recent years is qualitative documentation that 80% of Jews of color have experienced some kind of perceived discrimination in Jewish settings. So we know that to be true for the vast majority of Jews of color. But we don't necessarily, that's not Hannah's experience. What you have portrayed in this story is that Hannah, as someone who identifies as Jewish, and I'm going to presume that she is probably like a white Ashkenazi
Yeah.
Jew, she also feels othered and maybe not discriminated against, but she feels othered and receives judgment from her friend Shira. And I don't know that I've ever seen research out there about the gray area here, the
Mm-hmm.
spectrum of how we consider people who are Jewish versus Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved that you showed the dynamic between Hannah and her friend Shira, who is perceived to be the sort of like more traditional, more observant character in the book. Can you talk to me about that dynamic between them?
So I think it's very easy when you were raised in a specific Jewish community, whatever that specific way is, where you're taught that this is what it means to be Jewish. The people around you, we are Jews, we are the same, we are one. And then you grow up and you leave that little bubble and people who are Jewish in other ways. But if you've spent your whole life being surrounded by people who are really similar to you, and you're told that is what Jewish is, it can be hard to realize that is not the only thing that Jewish is. How you look, that goes for how you practice, that goes for who your parents are. And because it can be so easy to have such a narrow view of what Jewish is, that means a whole lot of people get excluded. A lot. And because Judaism can be a religion, an ethnicity, an identity, a culture, you can get locked into one view of it and ignore the others. So Hannah and Shira have this complicated relationship because, on the one hand, they're at this age where they've spent almost their entire lives being told what to think. And then you reach a point where you start to branch out into the world and you realize maybe this thing I've been told to think isn't quite accurate, but you don't necessarily have the language or the context to be able to express that fully. And I think that's where the conflict between them lies, and the fact that they're just starting to open their eyes to this. And that's why it was important to me when writing this book to not to let them make mistakes like that, and to let them say things that I wouldn't say but I might have said when I was 12, and to show what it looks like to make mistakes like that on the page, and also what it feels like to be on both ends of it, and what to do when you've realized that you have made a mistake in that way. um it was I wanted to really like show the every angle of that tension there. It's difficult to do because it's a difficult topic and it's a sensitive topic, and I wanted to handle it as elegantly as I could. And so I hope that people walk away with kind of an example of both what not to do and what to do, and also like the opportunity to like think about it and question it yourself and come to your own conclusions after.
One of the things you also do in A Recipe for Disaster that's fantastic is you have Hannah being othered by Shira and her feeling that judgment. And then you actually see Hannah doing that
Hmm.
herself to V. And I think it's
Hmm.
when V invites her over to make buñuelos for Hanukkah that this really comes to a head. Can you talk about Hannah's experience then perpetuating this experience to
Yeah.
others?
So Hannah has spent her life being told that she is Jewish because her mother is Jewish. And it doesn't matter what she practices, it doesn't matter what she believes. She is Jewish because of this fundamental piece about who she is. And she's been told that by her grandmother. And it was something that I was told growing up too. And there's a lot of comfort in that when you're feeling insecure about who you are, that there is this very Jewish thing about you that you cannot change no matter what you do. And when your entire identity confidence hinges on that one thing, seeing someone being confidently Jewish who doesn't have that one thing can throw you into a mental shipwreck. And that is what I wanted to portray when Hannah does other V, because it's coming from a place of Hannah's own identity being rocked. Whereas V doesn't care what people think because she knows who she is. And then when Hannah is also being othered by Shira because of how she practices, there are all these different ways to tether yourself to Judaism, and everyone clings to a different one. And when everyone does cling to a different one and everyone has a different one to cling to, that's where the tension arises.
What is the lesson that you hope readers take away from A Recipe for Disaster?
I hope people read it and leave feeling like they are the ones who get to decide who they are. And actually, I've had a lot of readers who aren't Jewish read this book and feel like they needed it so much in their own life context because of some other identity that they have felt people didn't want to give them willingly, whether it's the title of author or the title of women or the title of Jew or the title of whatever. Because I think in a lot of our conversations around identity, we're trying to move to a place where people get to choose who they are for themselves. But unfortunately, that's not the world that we live in. And so hopefully, people find this book who need that permission, because I know I needed that permission. And I hope the book gives it to them.
And as you apply it to today's world, what do you think readers who have comfort in their identity should take away from this book?
This book it's had different receptions depending on the readers. And I think that people who have derived comfort from their identity in a very traditional way and have used that, who have clung to that tether and in the process have dismissed other people who don't have that same tether. I think it's in their foundation a little bit. And so we've had some readers who don't like it as much. And I actually love that. I think the people who need this the most are actually the people who have done the othering in a lot of ways. One of my favorite uh, letters that I received from this book was from a kid who went, I don't even know how she found this book, but she's an Orthodox Jewish girl, young teen, who read it. And she's, I really liked this book, but I had a lot of problems with it. And she like listed just a whole bunch of stuff that either didn't track with her way of being Jewish. She's actually, we don't call it a bat mitzvah, we call it a bas mitzvah. And like just like this is a mistake, and this is a mistake, and this is a mistake. And actually this person is not Jewish, even though the book says that they are because of X, Y, and Z. And I loved this email. Like it is like one of my most prized possessions because I have no clue how this girl got this book, but I am so glad that she read it because even if she dismissed it outright, she read it and she thought about it and she is wrestling with it enough to write me an email. That's amazing. And even if her immediate reaction was to reject it, that she's not going to forget that this book existed. And 10 years from now, 20 years from now, if she has some experience that makes her think back on this book in one way or another, it'll still be there inside of her memory. And I hope she returns to it. I hope I get another email from her in 20 years saying, "Hey, just so you know, I've been thinking about this book and I changed my tune." And who knows? But I think that's actually like my favorite type of reader is somebody who finds a lot of comfort in who they are and can maybe use this to be a little more gracious with other people's self definitions.
Well, I think that's one of the beautiful things about literature is that you come across in books people and experiences that you may not otherwise interact with in your day-to-day
Mm,
life. And so it just
absolutely.
adds that perspective to what you might otherwise see. So
Windows and mirrors.
windows and mirrors, that's exactly right. In your newest story, Lucky Penny, it's a very sweet chapter book of friendship and the luck that you make. And it came out, of course, just in time for the Jewish New Year of Rosh Hashanah this year. It is a very different story
Hmm.
than Recipe for Disaster. Can you talk to me about this story, about the Jewish representation in it? Just talk to me about Lucky Penny.
Lucky Penny, I wanted it to be a little bit more traditional, but still have little glimpses of things that were maybe not quite as traditional because it's for a younger audience and it's not necessarily supposed to be majorly challenging in a Jewish context. I wanted to just tell a fun story about a girl who's Jewish and is obsessed with luck. So the story, it's about a girl who finds a penny that may or may not be cursed, and she is trying to reverse her bad luck in time for the Rosh Hashanah picnic because she wants to be chosen to blow the shofar. And the story, like Judaism is there as like the heart of it, but it's not about Judaism in any way. It's more thematic than anything and set around the Jewish New Year, but it is not about the Jewish New Year per se. It's about luck and it's about curses and it's about trying to break curses and it's about using glitter to stand in the place of salt and a white rabbit to be the opposite of a black cat. Like I wanted it to be silly and I wanted it to be goofy. Um, and I wanted it to just be fun.
Talk to me about what Jewish looks like in that book, because obviously you say it's a little bit more traditional, but you did give us glimpses in this story. Talk to us about what those glimpses might be.
One of the little glimpses is Penny's best friend Mara has two moms, and I wanted that to just be a thing and not be a big thing, just exist in the world of the story. I also wanted, and this is, I argue that this actually is a traditional concept, but it's like a little bit deeper than tradition. So the mitzvah behind the shofar is not blowing the shofar, it's hearing the shofar being blown. And I just think that's really beautiful. And so I wanted the whole focus of the book to be about Penny wanting to blow the shofar until she actually hears it being blown and realizes that was the real gift all along. And that's like a spoiler, but okay. um, and so I don't know if that necessarily counts as like non-traditional, but it is an interesting piece of Jewish depth that I found to be meaningful and that I wanted to incorporate in the story.
Friendship and family plays such an important role in this book, especially the relationship between the two main characters. Can you talk about how the relationship with Mara, maybe in particular, really helps Penny grow throughout the story?
So Penny and Mara are opposites. Penny is very optimistic and loves the spotlight and just wants to be in the middle of everything. And Mara is kind of her sidekick and isn't necessarily like the most bright and sunny of the bunch. And I think both of them thrive in those roles. I don't think either really wants to be the other person. Um, and I think Penny gets Mara into a lot of trouble. But the story is really about stepping aside, and sometimes your friend is more important than you, and it's more important to give your friend a chance to shine than it is to be in the center of attention all the time. That's the relationship that I wanted to show in the story. I also like that Mara is just down for anything Penny wants to do, no matter how absurd it is, how little sense it makes to her. She's just there, and that's friendship. Your friend is the one who's like a good friend bails you out of jail, but like a better friend is in jail with you. I enjoy their relationship. I like that they're just she's in it for the ride, and Penny is just she has ideas and yeah, that's the story I wanted to tell. But like not every friendship is perfect. And even the best friends sometimes have issues. Sometimes you overstep your boundary and you need to apologize for that. So I like atonement, as you maybe can tell.
Yeah, I see that theme threaded throughout both of
Yeah.
these two stories for sure.
Food
Uh,
and atonement, like the two most important features of being Jewish.
so speaking about food, talk to me about so a recipe for disaster. There's a lot of food in it, but I think that you actually did quite a lot of research for both books, probably inclusive of some of the food themes in both. Talk to me about what the research looked like for you for these books.
I baked a lot. So especially for Recipe for Disaster, because I went in thinking that I wanted to make it sciency. Like this is coming off of my first book, Emmy and the Key of Code, which is about a girl learning to program computers. And I was like, I'm the STEM writer. I'm going to write about STEM and what's more sciencey than cooking. And so I was reading about soda reacting with vinegar inside of a cake and like how that's one way to rise a cake. And the whole thing. And actually, one time we were baking a red velvet cake, which had vinegar and baking soda, and we accidentally swapped in the baking soda for baking powder. Baking powder has baking soda in it, but it's a lower concentration. And it didn't rise as much, and a lot of the vinegar remained unreacted. And so it tasted like vinegar, which was really interesting from a science perspective. So I went in being like, I am going to learn about the chemistry of cooking. And I baked a lot to make that happen. And then the book veered away from that. And then I was just baking for fun. But I have done a lot of apple honey cake research as well. There's an apple honey cake that is prominent in Lucky Penny, and that's just because I like apple honey cake. I have made that for many a Rosh Hashanah in my day.
What was the rest of your research like with the Jewish elements in the book?
So for Recipe for Disaster, I really did a lot of research. I was working closely with my rabbi friend, who was basically my rabbi. When the book launched, I actually gave myself a book mitzvah where I learned the Torah. I didn't learn to read the Torah portion that I would have had if I had been 13 having a bat mitzvah, but I did go through and read my Torah portion in English and do a deep dive into sort of what it meant. And I related back to like my own trajectory with being Jewish, writing this book in particular. And it just, and on top of that, my character Hannah has a Torah portion of the story, which I had to research also. And I gave her an intentionally very boring Torah portion just to torture her and maybe just to torture myself a little bit as well. Um, so I went and researched this Leviticus chapter and it worked out. So yeah, I did research a lot for Recipe for Disaster in particular. For Lucky Penny, it was maybe a little bit less because it's a much simpler story. It's not necessarily drawing like too, it's drawing more from like stuff that I already have experience with in Judaism. However, I had never heard of the tashlich, which is like the central kind of image at the end of Lucky Penny. And I actually learned about that in the process of writing it, where I was talking with a friend who had gone to a Jewish day school growing up, and I had decided I wanted to set this around Rosh Hashanah. And I was just asking, what sorts of things would you have done at a Rosh Hashanah picnic? And she's, oh, we might have done like the tashlich. And I looked it up, and I was like, this is perfect. And so I did research that quite a bit, and it's a beautiful ceremony. For those who don't know, you throw something, a rock or a piece of bread or something into flowing water to symbol casting away your sins of the last year and having a fresh slate going into the new year. I actually had various versions of this where like because they decorate the rocks, and I had versions where they were because like there's glitter in the story too, and I had originally them decorating using the glitter on the rock, and I was like, wait, it's probably not safe to put glitter on a rock and then throw the rock into a river or like a stream or whatever. It's not good for the wildlife, so we ended up changing it.
I like the science and the environmental aspect even of that too. This is fantastic. I want to thank you so much for coming to join me today on the Diverse Jewish Books podcast. Thank you, Aimee. And for those of individuals who haven't yet read A Recipe for Disaster or Lucky Penny, this is your sign to go ahead and read it.
Thank you so much. I had a great time talking to you. This was really a ton of fun.